The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 teachers in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with the Tennessee academic standards. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu. This video is aligned with the following Tennessee academic standards.
So I'm really sorry that we had to cancel because of the tornado warning. I'm from Massachusetts originally, and so for me that was really surprising. It was my first tornado warning down here, so thank you for bearing with us as we rescheduled. So today I'm really going to focus on academic language skills in emergent bilingual populations. But I really want to spend time talking about what academic language skills are, because I think that's sort of a confusing idea. It's something we talk about a lot, but we don't often define it. And so I want to spend time talking about that. And then I want to share some research with you, hopefully with the goal of convincing you to think about teaching these academic language skills in your classrooms. I always think, instructional time is our most valuable resource, and we should have to be convinced as educators that we should spend that instructional time on one activity over another. And so I think it's important to arm practitioners with research so that they can make those informed decisions. So when I think about language, I just want to remind us that it's sort of a complex topic when we talk about English language learners, in part because of the context in which language learning is happening. So language can obviously facilitate communication. That's the goal of language, but it can also hinder it, right? In classroom settings, we know that that happens. It can expand learning for emergent bilingual populations, or it can constrain learning. It can affirm and validate the voices that students bring when we equip them with language and we let them make those linguistic choices, or it can really silence them. So when I talk about academic language, I always remind us that it can work both ways, right? It's not necessarily something that's always supportive of our student populations, depending on how we deliver that instructional information. And so when we talk about language learning, we need to talk about the skills that students need to acquire, right? And specifically, I'm talking about academic language skills. And then we also need to think about the practices that students need to participate in as part of building that academic identity in a classroom. So we have a set of skills, language forms, and then we have a set of identities that go with those language skills. And we're developing both those things in our students. And because we have these two things that language learning entails, it's effective to study this from two entry points, right? So we often study this qualitatively by listening to students' voices, spending time in classrooms, but we also study it quantitatively by assessing language skills and examining that development. And I would argue that both of those strands of research are useful to understand language learning. And so today I really want to talk about some of the motivations for thinking about academic language in instructional settings. I want to share some research insights from work that I've done on my own and with colleagues around academic language in particular. So I want to share how we've defined and sought to assess these skills in learner populations. And then I want to share some quantitative and qualitative insights into how this language develops in student populations. And finally, I want to share a framework for you for teaching academic language that you might think about as you plan your own instruction. So in terms of thinking about the motivations for this work, something that we know is that emergent bilingual populations are continuing to grow in this country, right? And so very shortly, especially in states that have traditionally served emergent bilingual populations, they are or will be the majority student population. And we know here in Tennessee that our population of students who are speaking an additional language at home is growing very rapidly. And so the challenge, of course, is that at scale, we really, really struggle to capitalize on the skills these students bring. So theoretically, being a bilingual learner should have an advantage in a school setting, right? You already bring more language resources. You're adept at moving between languages. But at scale, we don't see that. At scale, we know that our emergent bilingual populations struggle at rates that are fairly significant compared to their unilingual peers. And so, this is happening, a growth in this population amidst a massive instructional challenge in our classrooms. So for those of you who have been teaching for a while, or for those of you who are just entering the profession, we have never expected more from our students in terms of the literacy skills that we are demanding. And so we don't really aim to equip students with basic literacy skills anymore. In fact, our goal is really to equip everyone with what we think of as advanced literacy skills, or the skills that allow us to read complex text, to talk about those texts, and to produce those texts. And as our society becomes more globalized, these demands are only increasing. So we're sort of at the beginning of a trajectory in which what we are expecting for learners is continuing to increase. And what we know about emergent bilingual populations is that while we're expecting more and more of their literacy skills, they struggle in large part in our school settings. So when we think of fourth graders in this country and eighth graders, the majority of them actually struggle with reading skills in emergent bilingual populations, over 90%. And in schools serving children that are growing up in low-income communities, these numbers are also quite high. And it is also the case that emergent bilingual populations are often coming of age in schools and communities that serve large numbers of students who are living in concentrated poverty. So there's an overlap in these two populations. And so the challenge, of course, is that while we know our students are struggling, we are just placing more complex text in front of them every day. So on the right, I have a text that's a little more conversational. And on the left, I have a text that is much more academic. If you sort of take a minute and look at those two texts, it's evident that they're different. And what we know about our learners is that they're often bringing more skill in these conversational forms than they are in these academic language forms. And so the big question then, after you look at that text though, is what is academic language? So if I tell you it's a struggle, what do I mean in terms of what the language features are that would be causing that difficulty? Well, if you look at this example, it's evident that there's different vocabulary, maybe the sentence structures are more dense, but there are a host of other features here that are actually contributing to some of this text comprehension difficulty. And so today I really want to spend time talking about those features. And so for a long time in the field, we thought about academic language and we made it synonymous with vocabulary. And there's a lot of overlap, right? Because if you know a lot of vocabulary words, you've had a lot of experience with concepts, you've probably read a lot of texts, and you've likely acquired these additional language features. But what it doesn't mean is that by teaching vocabulary alone, we equip you with knowledge of all those other language features that surround words in text. So that's sort of the entry point, right? Because what we know in the field is that through a host of successful academic vocabulary interventions, we've been able to raise students' vocabulary, but we've not seen commensurate gains in their reading comprehension skill. So this sort of led to a hypothesis that has driven a lot of the work that I've done with colleagues over the last 7 to 10 years. And the idea behind this work was that there were these additional language skills that were associated with text comprehension. And that if we could define these and examine their development in populations of adolescents, and specifically English learners, we'd be better able to address them in classrooms. Because what we assess and examine, what we make visible, is also what we're able to address instructionally. And so today, I want to talk a little bit about this academic language concept. I want to talk about the research that has suggested that the skills that I'm going to share with you contribute to text comprehension. And not only do these skills contribute to text comprehension within a single grade, but they contribute to this development across time in adolescent populations. I want to talk to you a little bit about the linguistic resources that kids have that we could leverage if we're going to begin this instruction in these language features in our classrooms. And I'm going to talk about this idea of a linguistically informed classroom and what might that mean for all of us that are teaching. And so I'm going to take a multiple methods approach, and I sort of talked about this a little bit before, why I think this is so important. And the reason I do that is because I take a developmental perspective, right? I see language learning as a developmental phenomenon, but I also see it as a sociocultural one, right? It's constructed through the activities and the interactions in classroom settings. And so let's start with this first piece, thinking about how we operationalize academic language proficiency. So when we think of ourselves as language users, each one of us has something called an idiolect. And those are all the language features that you individually know. And so none of us have the same profile, right? So if we look at any two people in the room and we were to map our language backgrounds, they would each be different, right? But we likely all have these various buckets of language knowledge. And in classrooms, the language that we tend to focus on very heavily are academic language skills. However, that's only one domain of the language knowledge that kids bring. So we're always remembering, as we're developing academic language, we are also, as we interact in these other communities, developing these other language skills. And so when I talk about academic language proficiency, I think of it this way. So on the one hand, there's knowledge of academic language features, knowledge of words, phrases, anything that you think of as an academic feature in the text, words like however, sentence structures, embedded clauses. Those are all academic language forms that you know. But that's not the only thing that you have to be aware of if you're actually going to use academic language. You also have to understand when to use that language and why you would use it, right? So why is this language more persuasive in this context than this other piece of language? Why should I use this in my persuasive or argumentative essay versus this piece of language? So you have to have some awareness of what readers are expecting or what's expected of you as a reader if you're going to know that you have to use your knowledge of academic language forms to make sense of or to produce a text. You also have to have awareness that you are choosing to use these language forms, right? So one thing that we find about students is that they're not often aware that they have to be active agents in making choices around when to use language or not to use language, right? But we know that that seems to be an important piece of this academic language puzzle. So on the one hand, we know that it requires knowledge of forms, right? But on the other hand, there's this whole other picture of what is required to be a successful academic language user in the classroom. So first I want to talk about this piece, though. What do you actually have to know in terms of language forms to navigate an academic text? Well, there are two buckets, two domains that we often think of. There's disciplinary language, right? So the language that exists in a science or a social studies or a history text. And then there's this whole set of language that actually stretches across those disciplines. So it's the language that allows me to talk to my colleague in physics. Now, maybe I can't read that physics paper with perfect understanding, but I have enough of a common academic register or language that I can read that text and understand quite a bit of it. And in my work, those are the language features that I focus on. And so I want to delineate those for you today because I think they're particularly high utility in classrooms, especially where students are moving across disciplines each and every day. So to determine the features that we would focus on as cross-disciplinary language features, we looked in a few places. So we sort of had a hunch that these existed, and the linguistics literature has suggested that for a long time. But we looked at the theoretical and empirical studies that have been done in linguistics, right? What features were being identified. We looked at quantitative studies that looked at language and reading relations. So in the field for a long time, there have been studies where we've thought about how a subcomponent of language knowledge relates to reading. So in courses, I'm sure you've come across studies that have looked at morphology knowledge and its relation with reading, or syntactic knowledge. So we knew that in the field we had an understanding that those features were important. And then we looked at studies that really examined language learning in context and suggested that there was something specific about schools that was really driving a lot of this language learning. And so we looked across these sources to try to determine, well, what are the features then that students need to know? And so we had this hypothesis that there was this high utility, cross-domain, cross-content area set of skills, language skills that were related with specifically reading comprehension. And this is the figure that we designed to really think about this work. And we call them core academic language skills, or CALS. And so I want to spend some time with a middle grade text, sort of breaking down what goes into each of these buckets of CALS knowledge. So obviously, there's academic vocabulary. And some of this will be cross-disciplinary, and that's the vocabulary we tend to focus on. And of course, some of this is disciplinary. So the bolded words in the textbook are part of this vocabulary dimension. But we really think about words like evidence, temperatures, decades, that you could find across content areas. There are words called connectives that writers use when they're connecting ideas in a text. And they're really like signposts or signals to you as a reader about how the information should be processed. So in this text, the author says, moreover, and we as readers need to be able to interpret the meaning of the phrase and understand what that means for how we look at the sentence before and then the sentence after that connective word. We need to be able to interpret a writer's viewpoint. So increasingly our standards ask us to do this. And the thing that's hard about academic text in particular is writers do not come out and say, I think this, right? It's often this very embedded stance taking that we have to be able to essentially read between the lines to interpret. And so it's words like extremely likely, or it may be the case, some evidence suggests, these words that we call hedges, that readers have to be able to interpret if they're going to gain a full understanding of what that author is communicating. We have to be able to unpack dense information in a text, so embedded clauses, syntactic structures that are complex. If we're going to understand those, we have to pull them apart. Because one of the goals of academic language is to put a lot of ideas into a relatively small bundle of language. And so for readers, that creates a challenge because you have to be able to pull those ideas out of that sentence. There are also a lot of words in academic text which are referred to as nominalizations. And so what we essentially do is take a verb and we make it a noun so we can talk about it. So concentrations is a really good example of that. A student would have to be able to draw on knowledge of that word to understand what it meant in this grammatical form. Complex syntactic structures, connecting ideas logically, also extends to this other idea. So if you read this for a second, what does this problem refer to? What do you have to do to be able to understand that? What does this problem refer to?
The Earth's temperatures have increased in recent decades.
Right, and so as a reader, you have to be able to go back in the text and find that chunk, that idea, and resolve that. It's actually a cataphor, right? You have to be able to go back. And so this is a challenge for readers, right? Because often we get through the text and we forget what we've read, or we don't know, we have to go back and reread. And so managing all of these linguistic challenges is something that an adolescent has to do, even when just reading a few sentences. And so when we think of this construct, what we know about these challenges is that they're occurring simultaneously. And so that's part of the difficulty that we face with academic language. And so in our assessment, we wanted to really measure these skills in adolescents. We wanted to know how they developed. And so we had to design tasks that would capture them. So we have a series of 8 tasks that have been designed to capture the skills that I just walked you through in that short text. And so then the question became, if we can capture these skills through an assessment, do they actually contribute to reading comprehension? Because if they don't, you have a serious problem with your measurement, right? And so as teachers, the question that we should always be asking ourselves is, if these skills are so important to teach, do they actually contribute to a meaningful outcome for our students? And so I want to talk to you a little bit about how the tasks that we designed actually related with reading comprehension. And so currently, the measure that we created has been used on about 6,700 kids, and we finished norming that assessment. And what's exciting about it is that we can now track development in fairly predictable ways across students in 4th to 8th grade. And we're starting now to examine whether there's a relationship between this measure and student writing. But today I really want to focus on reading. And so it's a fairly reliable measure. And the question becomes, does it relate with reading comprehension? So what would be your prediction? Does it relate with reading comprehension over and above vocabulary skills? Do you imagine it would? You might imagine it would. We hoped that it would. And so what did we find? Well, this is one study, and we've since replicated this with a much larger sample. But in our sample of middle grade students, 218 kids from 4th, 5th, and 6th grade classes, we examined whether the skills that we assessed contributed to their text understanding. And so we had a series of assessments. We had a reading comprehension assessment. We had our academic language assessment. We had a measure of vocabulary depth that looked at students' knowledge of words. And then we had a word reading fluency assessment. And before I sort of talk to you about the results, I want you to make some predictions based on what you know about students in your own classrooms. So, looking at skills such as connecting ideas logically or interpreting writers' viewpoints, I want you to keep a few students in mind as we go through this exercise. And I want you to think about how many of your students would know how to complete this sentence. Sam broke his leg. He continues to play basketball. What would you put in there? What would you put in there? Nevertheless, how many of your kids do you think would know that? Do we have any fourth grade teachers? Okay, fourth grade teachers. What percentage of kids in your fourth grade know that, do you think? Not a lot. Okay, so let's keep 40% in mind. What about eighth grade? Do we have any eighth grade teachers? Does anyone want to guess how many eighth graders knew that? What do you think? Yeah, so let's say more than 40, right? Because we know that these things develop over time, right? So let's say 60, right? So this is actually what we found, right? You're not that far off, right? About 36% of fourth graders could complete this. They knew what the word meant. And about 47% of eighth graders. So a little bit surprising for our eighth graders, right? I mean, for our fourth graders, I would say that's actually pretty positive, right? But for our eighth graders, I find that a little bit surprising. What about in contrast? What do we think for our fourth graders? How many of them probably knew this? A little higher? 60%? And why do you think that? So we use that more often, right? Nevertheless is something that I hardly ever say, but contrast probably comes up more in classrooms. So if we say that 60% of our fourth graders know it, then, I don't know, maybe we hope 80% of our eighth graders know it. Whoa. 15% of our fourth graders and about 50% of our eighth graders, right? So we were really surprised by this data. And we've seen this replicated across the larger sample. You know, this was a sample of about almost 600, and we keep seeing this pattern, right? So we often think that students know things, and we are surprised by what they actually do not know in terms of these cross-disciplinary words. And so this is variability in core academic language skill scores across single grades. And so each line essentially represents a child. So if you were imagining teaching in this fourth grade, what do you have to keep in mind about the academic language skills of students? They're pretty diverse, right? You have some fourth graders with academic language skills that approximate those of eighth graders, and you have some eighth graders with academic language skills that approximate those of our lowest performing fourth graders. There's a lot of variability within single grades, which suggests that we need to make these language skills visible to students if we're going to teach them. And so what did we actually find in relation to reading comprehension? Well, the thing that I want you to really focus on in this figure is looking at the starred numbers, because that tells us they were contributing something significant to reading comprehension. And what I'm essentially doing in this model is just adding in things that I think predict reading comprehension at each of these steps. And so the first thing that we said in this model was, well, you know, being an English language learner, we think will predict your reading comprehension. And it did in the first step. We thought that coming from a school or being an individual child who was receiving free and reduced price lunch, which is a marker of low socioeconomic status, would contribute to reading comprehension. We also believe that word reading skills vocabulary and academic language skills would make a contribution. So if I can just focus your attention for a second on this fourth model, what we see happening is that academic vocabulary is making a significant contribution, right? But now when we add in these other features, we also notice this, that academic language skills are contributing above academic vocabulary. So academic vocabulary is important, so are academic language skills. So we need to really be thinking about both of these things in our instruction. The other thing that was sort of illuminating to us in these models was this feature, in that socioeconomic status and English learner status made a much less significant, actually insignificant contribution when we accounted for these features. And there are a few reasons why that may be happening, but one of the reasons that we think this may be occurring is that we're capturing skills that might differentiate populations of children in these two groups from their peers, which would suggest to us that there's this malleable set of language skills, things that we can actually teach, that would better support our English learners and their peers growing up in low-income homes. So one of the challenges that we always face in schools is how to support these populations. And so while there's a whole constellation of things we should be thinking of, this was some of our initial evidence that these skills are likely an important thing for us to be considering instructionally. And so one thing that we can say from this data is that there's a lot of variability in academic language skills, but that they contribute to reading comprehension in schools. And so one of our primary instructional goals going forward is going to be to think about how to build, develop, and make these skills visible in populations. And so a question that you should be asking me, though, is does this relate to reading comprehension over time? Right? I only have so much instructional time. And if this is going to just bump my students' reading comprehension in the short term, and it's not really going to move them long term, I need to be investing my instructional time somewhere else. And so I want to really think about what might some of these relationships be over time in our population. And so in this study, we have 833 kids who we followed across 2 academic years. And we met these kids in 6th grade, and we followed them through 7th. And we assessed them at 4 time points, at the beginning and the end of the academic year. And we had a few questions. We wondered how these skills developed over time in emergent bilingual kids, or English learner kids, and their unilingual peers. We wanted to know if there was the same rate of development in these skills, or how much they differed at different time points. And we also wanted to know if development in academic language skills was related to development in reading comprehension for these kids over time. So we gave students a few measures at these various time points. One was a reading comprehension measure, which was designed to assess something called deep comprehension. It's a measure that involves reading a series of texts, emails, blog posts, expository text, for a specific purpose. So students had to, in one of the tasks, discuss whether satellites were of value. In another task, they had to weigh in on whether a wind farm should be placed in their community. And they were given source text to help them make that argument. And so it was a reading comprehension assessment, but it was tapping additional reading comprehension skills beyond those that we usually assess in standard measures. And then we had the core academic language skills assessment that I've told you a little bit about before. And so what do we know about this development over time? Well, our English proficient students, or unilingual students in this sample primarily, are on the top, and our emergent bilingual learners are falling significantly behind them at every time point that we assess them. But here's the thing that I want us to keep in mind as instructors. So this shouldn't be surprising, right? By definition, emergent bilinguals are developing language, right? But the thing I want us to keep in mind is this. There was no difference in the rates of growth, right? So students were growing at the same rate they were developing, but there's sort of this paradox at play where we start off significantly behind, and even though we're doing everything we need to do, our peers are also learning. And so we're just not catching up across the period that we studied students. And so that suggests a few things for us as educators, one of them being that if we could only raise the amount of learning that was happening for our emergent bilingual learners, perhaps we would see a bit of a jump here. And so a lot of the work that I've undertaken recently has been to think about that piece of the puzzle. How can we raise this rate of development in our classrooms? And so I want to talk to you about how these skills are related. And I put this complex model here because you're going to see these in studies. And I think practitioners should be informed about how to interpret models like this, because it's not as complicated as it looks. Essentially, it's telling us two things. Imagine each of these bubbles, right, is representing a skill and growth in that skill. And so at the top, I have core academic language skills. And on this side, I have where those skills started. And on this side, I have how those skills grew and developed over the 2 years of the study. And on the bottom, I have students' reading comprehension skills. And so by looking at the paths that connect them, we're asking a question related to, well, did these initial rates contribute to growth in this other skill? And was growth over time connected in these skills? And so I want to really unpack what we found, because I think it has some important implications for our instruction. So the first thing that we found, no surprise, is that in grade 6, at the start of the study, kids with higher core academic language skills also had higher reading comprehension skills. This should make perfect sense to us, right? Also, we found that rates of growth in these skills were linked, right? So kids who grew faster as academic language users also developed reading comprehension skills more quickly. But this is where it starts to get kind of interesting. So initial core academic language skills at the start of grade 6 were related with growth in reading comprehension at the end of grade 7. Right? So for our students in schools, 6th and 7th graders, where you're starting as an academic language user is contributing to this development over time in your reading comprehension skill. And that makes good sense, right? Because if you're starting with this language, reading text is probably a little bit easier. And that skill supports you in engaging with more and more text that is more complex. But the piece that I found sort of interesting and was not borne out in this model is that starting reading comprehension levels were not related to faster growth in academic language skills. We've replicated this again and again in different populations now, and it was very surprising to us. And I spent a lot of time thinking about, well, why might that be the case? And I have a few suppositions, but the one that I think stands out to me the most is that potentially learning via text is particularly challenging for students. Acquiring language through reading can be a challenging process, especially as you're being accountable for acquiring those ideas from the text also. And so potentially, students are unable to use those opportunities as frequently to bolster their academic language skills. So something to keep in mind as we start to sort of think about the instruction around these skills is it may not be enough to simply place students in front of complex text. That may have to be mediated and supported in ways that actually lead to development in these language skills. And so if we think about this work, it tells us something important, that we really need to think about our emergent bilinguals. We need to bolster their skills, and that we have an important role to play as educators in mediating that academic language learning via text. And so I showed you this figure before, and now I want to come back to this piece, right? Awareness of the situational expectations and your agency as language users and how that may contribute to this bigger picture of academic language learning. So the question becomes, if we're actually going to do this work in classrooms that makes language learning visible and supports students to acquire these skills, what skills are they already bringing that we may be able to leverage? And so I want to share a study with you where we actually spent time trying to get a sense of what the metalinguistic resources were that kids brought with them. So what resources did kids have to think about language that they already brought to the classroom that we could build on? And so today I want to share with you some ways in which children were able to talk about language before we even provided instruction in how to engage in those activities. And so we had this hypothesis that in classrooms it would be much more efficient if we could make our expectations for language use visible. And we also wondered if middle graders could do some of this work before we even taught them how to talk about language. Because if they could, they already had a set of skills that we could leverage. And so the challenge, though, was that we actually know very little about how adolescents and middle graders do this. We know quite a lot about how young children, especially young children interacting with parents, do a lot of this work around noticing language. We just didn't know what middle schoolers were doing. And so this study really spent a lot of time asking those students to tell us what they knew. And we sat back and we listened. And so we had 4th to 8th grade students, and we were attempting to gain some insights into what they already knew. And to do this, we had focus groups with students. And we've since replicated this study with much larger numbers, and some of the same themes seem to be recurrent. To help students get thinking about language, we provided this task. We offered students definitions of words that were familiar, some of them that used academic language and some that were more conversational. And we asked the kids, well, which is for an adult and which might be for a child? Can you talk about it and tell us how you made those decisions? And we spent a lot of time saying this phrase, what made you say that? And we were hoping that children could identify language features that we thought of as part of the academic register. And so what we found was that students actually have lots of ways to talk about language, not surprisingly. On the one hand, they could name a lot of lexical features. They could talk about word level features extensively. And this is where they spent most of their time. So when we asked them which was academic and which was conversational, they primarily pointed at words to differentiate texts. And so they said things about academic words like, well, words that give better details, words we see in writing, hard words, advanced words. And when they were talking about conversational words, they said, well, slang words, easy words, this is a little kid's word, to help differentiate between the two. They were also able to identify morphosyntactic features, right? So larger units of language beyond the word level. Kids said things like, well, you know, there are more commas here, so this is probably the academic one. Or there are bigger words, more words, larger sized words, right? And students also were able to identify some discourse features, although in the corpus, this was much less frequent than their identification of word level features. And so what sort of struck us, right, was that none of this was particularly surprising in and of itself. We'd all been classroom teachers for a while before we did this study. But the part that was kind of disturbing was this piece. There was a real clear language hierarchy that was emerging out of students' discussion of language features. So there was good language, there was better language, right? And when we think about what's the opposite of that, well, bad language, not as high quality language. And that was worrisome to us, right? Because when we think about language development, we're developing academic language, but we certainly don't want students to lose the language that they bring, especially true of emergent bilingual populations. And so the language was particularly evaluative, and this raised a lot of concerns for us as educators, right? A question about how could we do this academic language instruction, build knowledge of these features in ways that would not result in a linguistic hierarchy. Because if you start to see your language as less valuable, is there a reason to retain it? Is there a reason to keep using the other language that you have? And we certainly didn't want academic language learning to be a form in which students were losing language. And so this brings me to sort of a piece of the work that I've spent a lot of time thinking about recently. So on the one hand, we know that core academic language skills contribute to reading comprehension. It's likely important that we teach them in our classrooms. We know that these skills are likely malleable. There's a lot of research in the field that suggests that we can teach these skills. But on the other hand, while students have metalinguistic resources that we can leverage to do this work, we run the risk of reinforcing a linguistic hierarchy that they bring with them. So it's a challenge for those of us that are working in classrooms. And so I've started to think more and more in my own work about what does this mean for instruction, right? How can we do this in ways that are equitable, that promote learning, and are supportive of the language resources that kids bring? And so I started to think that in terms of turning to instruction, we're in a period where we need to start thinking about moving away from the teaching of grammar in the traditional sense, teaching formal linguistic labels, and instead thinking of building on the knowledge students bring to continue to develop these language skills. So it means we're engaging in a much more dialogic process about language, why writers make the choices they do, why readers need to be cognizant of those choices when they read. And the goal is a little bit different than some of our traditional approaches. So in traditional approaches to building academic language, the goal was to develop successfully reading children, right? To develop our learners as successfully able to navigate academic text. And while that's a valuable goal, I would say that as we start to understand this academic language picture in more depth, we're starting to hit on this idea instead. That while we're building this language, what we're trying to do is give students options to conform to or depart from traditional language choices. And we want them to be able to do that in ways that are linguistically informed. So we want to give students awareness of an array of language choices, academic language being one of those. And we want to equip them with the ability to make choices around when that language is effective across different contexts. And so we've started to do some of this work in schools. I'm working in a few schools that work with bilingual learners. And we've developed some units in which we engage students in this language choice making. And across the unit, we start to see that students become more aware of how language choices impact how they're understood and how writers are using language to communicate certain ideas. And I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And so when Amy invited me to do this, I thought it was really exciting because I think practitioners are at the forefront of doing this work in classrooms. So there are obviously needs to be continued research, but I would say that a lot of this work has to happen in classroom settings, right? If we're going to really bring to scale this language-focused instruction, we need to be moving between research and practice, thinking about how those two relate. And there are a lot of questions that we still have that we need to continue to investigate. And so for those of us that think a lot about practice, a lot of questions remain about what are the roles of educators in scaffolding this language? How do we do that in ways that honor the language that students bring? Specifically, what are the teacher moves that are linked with moving students in these domains? We started to think about accountable talk and some of these strategies, the instructional conversation, dialogic reading. What is the constellation of things that actually move these outcomes for our learners? How can we expand students' content knowledge while supporting them to develop these language skills? And how do we do this in ways that value the language that children bring, that value the sociocultural and dialect resources that our students bring to the classroom? And how is this linked with the disciplines? And finally, where I'm spending most of my work currently, is thinking about how we can help educators to think about this work in their classrooms and how they can teach us in the research community about what this looks like on the ground. And so I thank you for listening today. I am so sorry about having to miss you last time, but I'm glad you could make it. And I'm sure some of you have questions, so I'd love to take those and have a conversation with you. Are there any questions?
So I'm working with linguistically-diverse college students in what was typically called developmental reading. And I'm wondering what studies or things you would point to for, I find a lot of things for, older adolescents, high school, bleeds over, it's typically working with freshmen, but just want to get your thoughts on that area.
Yeah, so I actually think that's a really hugely important population to be thinking about. And one thing I can tell you about the CALS construct is that when we started looking at the linguistics research, it's amazing how much work has been done with adult populations in the age group that you work with. Not necessarily students who are unilingual or who are non-mainstream dialect speakers, but often with students in an English as a foreign language context. And while it's somewhat difficult to make that map back to our students in US instructional contexts, we do know that a lot of those same skills have overlap, especially when we start to think about their academic writing. And so recently we have a grant that we're working on now where we're mapping academic writing development. And so I've been spending a lot more time looking at studies in that age group that you work with. And what I can say is that we're recurrently seeing the features that we mapped in CALS as relevant to writing. I'm especially thinking of the English for academic purposes work and thinking about how this construct is really reflected in a lot of that work, especially as we start to talk about how language features are meaningful for communication.
What are ways that we can help, between kindergarten and second grade, those young ages, reiterate, practically the importance of their first language as they're learning their second language, because it's so important to do together. Because when I tutor the sixth graders, a lot of them have lost that L1 just because they came to America and they're I guess just learn English. So how do you encourage that at that kind of K to 7?
I would say that a lot of it is oral language exposure. So it turns out that rich talk and exposure to the language of text orally is looking to be, in a lot of studies, to be sort of the antecedent. So I will say that mapping the construct of core academic language down to younger children is something that's somewhat incomplete in our work, but that there are other researchers that are taking up the construct to think about that. And what they're finding is that a lot of those complex interactions around language are happening when students and teachers are talking. And so it appears, though, that in a lot of classrooms, there's a lot less rich talk than we would like to see. And so when I think about setting up our students to be really successful later on in tackling complex language and text, I think it has to start with more dialogic classrooms with young children. You know, the other population that we want to be really mindful of, not just our emergent bilingual kids, but students who are speakers of non-mainstream dialects, whether it's Southern American English, African American English. These students too are bringing incredible language resources, and then they are acquiring academic language at school. And so there's been a lot of recent work. There's an intervention called Toggle Talk that's interesting in how it supports students. They're all students in the South in large urban areas who are both speakers of Southern American English and different dialects of African American English. And what they're finding is that helping kids toggle or move between conversational and academic language is helping them to identify academic language features because they're more marked. So whenever you're doing that contrast between types of language, it helps you zoom in on how the language is different. And so with bilinguals, we talk about like a noticing hypothesis, where you notice how your language is different than the language you're being exposed to or you're hearing. And actually engaging students in those exercises where we look at language and we study how it is different when we're saying different things to different people and how those features map and change seems to be a really powerful approach, not just for bilinguals. And so I do think some of that work can be really helpful even with very young children. What we know is that starting at even, age 2, children are pragmatically aware and they move between different types of language. So I don't know if you have young children at home, but if you have a baby and a 3-year-old, that 3-year-old will use baby talk to that baby. And so we even start to see this movement between different types of language with very young children. And so there's a reason to believe that kids are fairly adept at doing this. And in classrooms, as we make that explicit and spend more time contrasting types of language, we are only building on those skills and fostering them. But Toggle Talk is kind of cool. I would check it out.
When you discuss the dichotomy of the good vocabulary versus the bad words, the bad, one issue that I ran into with ESL students, usually being that they didn't have the confidence. So I can't understand these good words. How are there strategies to build that confidence in your students? Because I feel like that can be a mental barrier to building more academic language.
So something to keep in mind with academic language use, I think sometimes, and I remember this when I was teaching, we don't always think about older kids as still developing language in the same way. We think of, so if you have a young child and they make a mistake when they're speaking, or an incomplete construction, we find it humorous. With older children, our tendency is to immediately correct, right? And something that we sort of know about language learning is that it's sort of an approximation. And so when we're dealing with middle school kids and we're teaching academic language, one of the first things that we'll see them do is adopt that language in ways that are very formulaic. So, that's when we start to get into, I'm seeing it a lot in the writing data I look at, word for word copying, right, of certain sentence structures. And while we can look at that as problematic, and we need to have discussions about that with our students, it's also the case that a lot of that is part of language learning. And so as teachers, if we can start to sort of let go of some of this tendency around wanting things to be, language to be produced almost perfectly immediately, and understand that there's this progression. Sometimes it begins with this total adoption of our language. It's a process of learning to use these words, and we encourage students and commend them for those attempts. We can start to change what is a culture in schools where we tend to not view adolescents as developing linguistically. And so what you're fighting against is a very instantiated set of understandings around who can use language, what it looks like, and what a good language user looks like. But if we can turn it on its head and have a lot of conversations about skilled language users' practice, and we don't do it right the first time, and the first time you write something, it probably isn't going to be the way you want it to be, and the first time you say it, you might use the word in a way that's sort of non-conventional, and that is a developmental process. I find that adolescents like that idea, but it takes a lot of talk around that. And if you're in a classroom that embraces that mindset, your colleagues across the hall may not. And so it's a constant counterculture activity to really value that work. But I think it's really important. And I've seen kids respond incredibly quickly when they start to understand that we value the experimentation with language.
Can you spend 1 second on the similarities or dissimilarities between this and CALPS? Has CALPS kind of been replaced by this, or?
Yeah, so I think there's an interesting theoretical overlap. So has everyone, so I saw you had a Jim Cummins building. Is that up the street? Is that the same Jim Cummins? So there was this, he's a bilingual, development scholar. And he had this idea called boch and CALPS. Has everyone heard of that idea? One of them was this basic interpersonal communication skills were bochs, and CALPS were cognitive, academic, language proficiency skills, I think. And it was in 1970s up through the 90s, he was writing about this concept. And where it came from was Jim Cummins' observation in Canadian schools that a lot of English language learners were acquiring conversational language much more quickly, and then the trajectory for acquiring academic language was much longer. And so, what's sort of interesting about that was bochs and CALPS were these sort of broad buckets of skills that were not very well defined, but it was sort of there's this academic set of things, and then there's this more conversational set of things. And so I would say that where CALS fits in that, it's just a much more precise definition of what actually would go in that academic language bucket. And what's really, I think, cool about that work is that it is very rare that things go from bilingual theories to theories for monolinguals, right? Usually it's the other way around. We take theories of monolingual reading development, writing development, and we put those on bilingual populations, and then we're like, oh, this doesn't quite work. And then we have to rethink it. But bochs and CALP, in terms of how they have transitioned, is we actually find that in our populations of monolingual kids, there's a lot of reason to think that bochs and CALP are also borne out, right? That the academic language is a challenge for a lot of our kids who speak English at home all the time, primarily because they just get a lot less exposure to it than they do to the conversational language. Any other questions? Well, you can email me too if you think of something later. But thank you so much. It was such a joy to come and talk to you, and I hope some of this is useful to you in your classrooms.